What if everything you think you know about human evolution is wrong? What if big brains aren't destiny, but just one option among countless possibilities nature can create? What if, hidden on a remote island in Indonesia, there existed proof that intelligence doesn't require size, that evolution can take roads we never imagined, that our family tree is far stranger and more twisted than any textbook dares to admit? This isn't speculation. This isn't fantasy. In 2003, archaeologists descended into Liangbua Cave on Flores Island and discovered something that violated every rule, every assumption, every comfortable theory about what it means to be human. September 6, 2003. The excavation site was 6 meters beneath the cave floor, deep enough that sunlight became a memory, that air grew stale, that every breath tasted of ancient dust. Benjamin Taros, a local worker hired for the dig, was scraping sediment from the bottom of a 2x2-meter square when his tools hit something that wasn't rock. He stopped, brushed away dirt with careful fingers, and there, emerging from earth that hadn't been disturbed in tens of thousands of years, was the top of a skull. Not large, not impressive, just a small dome of bone, impossibly fragile, impossibly old, impossibly present. Wahyu Saptomo, the Indonesian archaeologist overseeing the sector, immediately climbed down and joined Benjamin at the bottom of the pit. They worked together, removing sediment grain by grain, revealing more of the cranium with agonizing slowness. And the more they uncovered, the stranger it became. Wahyu called over Rokus Du Aw, the team's faunal expert, to inspect what they'd found. Rokus examined the partially exposed skull, measured its proportions, assessed its characteristics. His conclusion was immediate. This was a hominin, definitely human family, but given the size of the brain case, it had to be a child. No adult human had a skull this small. It was impossible. The team documented everything, took photographs from every angle, and prepared to continue excavation. But when they returned 2 days later and exposed more of the skull, something didn't add up. Thomas Sutikna, the lead Indonesian archaeologist for the project, joined Wahyu at the bottom of the square to supervise the delicate work of uncovering the rest of the specimen. Days passed. The skull emerged fully. Then the jaw. Then teeth. And Rokus realized his mistake. These weren't baby teeth. They were permanent adult teeth, fully erupted, showing wear from years of use. This wasn't a child. This was a fully grown adult with a skull the size of a grapefruit, a brain approximately 1/3 the size of modern humans. The team continued excavating with increased urgency and mounting disbelief. By the end of the field season, they had recovered much of the rest of the skeleton. Leg bones, arm bones, pelvis, ribs, enough to reconstruct what this individual looked like in life, and what they reconstructed shouldn't exist. The skeleton, later designated LB1 or Liangbua 1, belonged to a female who stood approximately 1 meter tall, maybe 1.06 meters at most. She weighed perhaps 25 kilograms, less than most 10-year-old children. Her brain had a volume of roughly 420 cubic centimeters, comparable to a chimpanzee, dramatically smaller than the 1,300 cubic centimeters of average modern humans. Her arms were proportionally long. Her shoulders sloped forward. She had no chin. Her forehead receded sharply. And her feet were disproportionately large for her short legs, giving her a somewhat clumsy appearance. She looked, in many ways, more like Australopithecus lucy than like any member of the Homo genus. But the geological context was wrong. Lucy lived 3.2 million years ago in Africa. This skeleton was found in layers dating to approximately 60,000 years ago on an island thousands of miles from Africa. The implications were staggering. If this was a diseased modern human, then the disease would have to explain not just the small stature, but the primitive skull shape, the archaic limb proportions, the chimpanzee-sized brain. No known pathology explained all these features simultaneously. But if this wasn't a diseased modern human, if this was a distinct species, then human evolution was far more complex, far more diverse, far stranger than anyone had imagined. The scientific team worked through the options, debated the evidence, examined every alternative explanation. And finally, in 2004, they published their findings in the journal Nature. They announced the discovery of a new species of human, Homo floresiensis. The Hobbit. The nickname came immediately, inspired by J.R.R. Tolkien's fictional race of small people. Some researchers hated it, thought it trivialized one of the most important discoveries in anthropology. But the name stuck because it captured something essential about the find. These were real hobbits, not fantasy, not myth. Real, living, breathing humans who stood barely a meter tall and somehow survived on an Indonesian island until shockingly recent times. Initially, the dating suggested they lived until 12,000 years ago, which would make them contemporaneous with early agriculture, with the end of the Ice Age, with the dawn of civilization. The idea that a species of tiny humans with chimpanzee-sized brains existed while humans were building the first cities was almost too radical to accept. But science doesn't care about comfort. In 2016, more precise dating techniques pushed the extinction date back to approximately 50,000 years ago. Still recent. Still within the time frame of modern human expansion across Southeast Asia. Still suspicious in its timing. Because 50,000 years ago is exactly when Homo sapiens reached the region, when our ancestors spread from Africa through Asia, when multiple other human species, Neanderthals and Denisovans, and who knows what else, began disappearing from the archaeological record. The correlation was impossible to ignore. Modern humans arrived. Other humans vanished. Every single time. Was this coincidence? Competition for resources? Climate change? Or something darker that we don't like to admit about our own species? The skeleton in Liang Bua Cave wasn't alone. As excavations continued over subsequent years, archaeologists recovered remains from at least 15 individuals. Partial skeletons, isolated teeth, jaw fragments, limb bones, all showing the same characteristics: small stature, tiny brains, primitive features. This wasn't a single diseased individual. This was a population, a breeding community of small-bodied humans who lived, reproduced, and survived on Flores Island for hundreds of thousands of years. Stone tools found in the same layers as the bones showed that these people manufactured sophisticated implements. They hunted, they butchered meat, they adapted to their environment with intelligence that seemed impossible given their brain size. And that's where the mystery truly begins, because Homo floresiensis breaks every rule we thought we understood about intelligence and brain size. For more than a century, anthropologists assumed that human evolution was defined by increasing brain size. Bigger brains meant smarter humans. Bigger brains meant better tools, more complex language, superior adaptation. The whole story of human evolution was supposedly the story of encephalization, of brains growing larger and larger until modern humans achieved the massive 1,300 cubic centimeter brains that supposedly made us special. But here on Flores Island lived humans with brains 1/3 that size, who still made tools, still hunted successfully, still survived for longer than most species ever do. They proved that big brains weren't necessary for intelligence, that evolution could take different paths, that there are things about consciousness and cognition and what it means to think that we fundamentally don't understand. The tools found at Liang Bua weren't crude rocks. They were shaped implements, carefully worked stone designed for specific purposes. Cutting tools, scraping tools, hunting weapons. The archaeological record showed evidence that Homo floresiensis hunted juvenile stegodon elephants, also dwarfed by island evolution. They caught large rodents. They coped with predators including giant Komodo dragons that could easily kill a creature so small. And they may have controlled fire. All of this requires planning, foresight, cooperation, and problem-solving skills that supposedly require large, complex brains. But somehow, with just 420 cubic centimeters of neural tissue, these tiny humans accomplished everything that supposedly required triple that capacity. Modern neuroscience has no explanation for this, brain imaging studies consistently show correlations between brain size and cognitive capacity. Larger brains generally mean more processing power, more memory, more capacity for abstract thought. There are limits to how much you can miniaturize neural tissue before function degrades. But Homo floresiensis existed well below those supposed limits. Their brains were smaller than any hominin species known to use complex tools. Yet the tools existed. The evidence was undeniable, which meant that either our understanding of brain function is wrong, or these tiny humans had reorganized their neural architecture in ways we don't comprehend. Research into the shape of the hobbit brain provided some clues. CT scans of the LB1 skull revealed that despite its overall small size, certain brain regions were disproportionately large. The temporal lobes involved in language processing and long-term memory were unusually developed. The frontal regions associated with planning and abstract thought showed unexpected complexity. It was as if evolution had performed neural triage, maintaining the most critical functions while sacrificing overall size. But this raised more questions than it answered. How do you maintain advanced cognition while dramatically reducing the total number of neurons? How do you keep the connections that matter while cutting everything else? And most disturbing, if small brains can be intelligent, what does that say about the relationship between our own large brains and our consciousness? The Discovery team stood in that cave in 2003, holding bones that shouldn't exist, looking at evidence that contradicted a century of anthropology, confronting proof that human evolution was stranger and more diverse than anyone imagined. They didn't know yet about the full implications, didn't know about the 700,000-year-old ancestors showing similar small body size, didn't know about the stone tools predating the fossils by hundreds of thousands of years, didn't know about the local legends of Ebu Gogo, the small hairy people who supposedly lived in caves and died out only centuries ago. All of that would come later. But in that moment, holding a skull the size of a cantaloupe, seeing adult teeth in a jaw meant for a child, measuring limb bones that belonged to a species that shouldn't exist, they knew they had found something that would change everything. Not just about Flores Island, not just about Indonesia, about what it means to be human, about how many ways nature can create intelligence, about how little we truly understand our own origins. The Hobbit people were real, and their existence meant that everything we thought we knew about human evolution, about intelligence, about who we are and where we came from, needed to be rewritten from scratch. The skeleton designated LB1 lay in a laboratory at the University of Wollongong in Australia, under bright lights, surrounded by measurement instruments and imaging equipment. Scientists from around the world had come to see it, to study it, to try to understand what they were looking at. And every measurement, every analysis, every new data point made the mystery deeper. This wasn't just a small human. This was a biological impossibility that somehow existed anyway. The cranial capacity measurements were repeated multiple times by different researchers using different techniques. Water displacement, CT scanning, 3D modeling. Every method returned essentially the same result. 420 cubic centimeters. Some measurements suggested possibly 426 cubic centimeters at the upper limit. But no matter how you calculated it, the brain of Homo floresiensis was roughly the size of a chimpanzee brain, approximately one-third, the volume of a modern human brain averaging 1,300 cubic centimeters. To put this in perspective, even Australopithecus africanus, which lived 3 million years ago and wasn't even in the Homo genus, had brains around 450 cubic centimeters. The earliest members of Homo habilis, the supposed first toolmakers, had brains around 600 cubic centimeters. Homo erectus, which may have been the ancestor of Floresiensis, had brains ranging from 850 to 1,200 cubic centimeters. The trajectory of human evolution had always pointed toward larger brains. Except here. Here evolution had reversed course. But brain size was only part of the puzzle. Body proportions told an equally strange story. The LB1 skeleton showed a standing height of approximately 106 centimeters, about 3.5 feet. Weight estimates based on skeletal dimensions suggested around 25 kilograms, roughly 55 pounds. This made Homo floresiensis smaller than any other known hominin species, except perhaps the very earliest African ancestors. But the body proportions weren't simply scaled-down versions of modern humans. The arms were long relative to the legs. The shoulders were structured differently, more primitive, more ape-like. The pelvis was broad but short. The feet were disproportionately large, measuring about 20 centimeters long, with a primitive structure lacking the modern human arch. Walking would have been possible, but perhaps awkward, with a somewhat waddling gait rather than the efficient striding of modern humans. The skull revealed even more peculiarities. The face was small, with a flat vertical profile. The orbits, the eye sockets, were positioned high on the face. There was no chin, just a receding jawline that gave the profile an archaic appearance. The teeth were small, but not exceptionally so, proportional to the jaw size. Wear patterns on the molars indicated a diet that included tough plant materials, possibly roots and tubers, along with meat from hunted animals. The cranial bones were thick, robust, designed to withstand stress, and the brow ridges, though present, were less pronounced than in other archaic humans like Homo erectus or Neanderthals. Everything about the skull morphology suggested a mosaic of primitive and derived features, a mix that didn't fit neatly into any existing evolutionary model. The brain itself, or rather the endocast showing its shape inside the skull, revealed the most intriguing details. When researchers created a virtual 3D model of the brain cavity, they discovered something unexpected. Despite the overall small volume, certain brain regions showed disproportionate development. The temporal lobes, located on the sides of the brain, were unusually large. These regions process auditory information, language comprehension, and long-term memory formation. Why would a brain-limited hominin invest precious neural real estate in these specific functions? The most obvious answer was language. If Homo floresiensis had some form of spoken communication, even rudimentary language, then enlarged temporal lobes made sense. But this raised a profound question. Could a 420 cubic centimeter brain support language? Modern human language requires extensive neural networks spanning multiple brain regions. It demands abstract thinking, symbolic representation, syntactic processing, and complex memory systems. Could all of that fit in a brain 1/3 the normal size? The frontal regions of the Floresiensis brain also showed unexpected complexity. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for planning, decision-making, and executive function, appeared more developed than would be expected for such a small overall brain size. This suggested cognitive abilities beyond what brain volume alone would predict. Neuroscientists call this phenomenon neural reorganization, the idea that brain function depends not just on total size, but on how neural tissue is structured and connected. In theory, you could maintain cognitive capacity while reducing brain size by optimizing neural architecture, eliminating redundant connections, and streamlining processing. But this had never been observed in any living species. Homo floresiensis appeared to be the first and only example of dramatic brain reduction without corresponding cognitive loss. The archaeological evidence supported this interpretation. Stone tools found in the same stratigraphic layers as the Homo floresiensis. Fossils showed sophisticated manufacturing techniques. These weren't simple flaked rocks. They were carefully shaped implements showing evidence of planned reduction strategies. The toolmakers had selected appropriate raw materials, struck flakes at specific angles to create sharp edges, and produced consistent tool forms suggesting learned cultural traditions. Some tools showed signs of hafting, attachment to wooden handles, which requires forward planning and multi-step manufacturing processes. The presence of burned bone and sediments suggested possible fire use, though direct evidence remained ambiguous. And the faunal remains, the animal bones found alongside the tools, showed cut marks and breakage patterns consistent with systematic butchery. The prey species provided additional context. Homo floresiensis apparently hunted juvenile stegodon elephants, a now extinct species that had also undergone island dwarfing. Adult stegodons stood perhaps 1.5 meters at the shoulder, much smaller than mainland elephants, but still enormous compared to the meter-tall hobbits. Killing even juvenile stegodons would require cooperation, planning, and probably some form of weapons. The archaeological record also showed remains of giant rats, some as large as small dogs, which the hobbits apparently hunted and consumed. Komodo dragon bones appeared in some layers, though whether the hobbits hunted them or scavenged them remained unclear. The key point was diversity. The hobbits exploited multiple food sources, adapted to different prey animals, and showed behavioral flexibility that indicated problem-solving intelligence. But here's where the paradox becomes acute. In the entire fossil record of human evolution, no hominin species with a brain size around 400 cubic centimeters has ever been associated with stone tool manufacture of any complexity. Australopithecus species, with brains in the 400 to 500 cubic centimeter range, left no tools. The earliest stone tools, appearing around 3.3 million years ago, were probably made by hominins with brains of at least 550 to 600 cubic centimeters. And those earliest tools, called Oldowan technology, were much simpler than the tools found at Liang Bua Cave. The Floresiensis tools showed more advanced techniques, closer to the Acheulean tradition associated with Homo erectus and later species with much larger brains. So how did a species with a brain smaller than any known toolmaker create tools more advanced than the earliest tool technologies? The answer has to involve neural reorganization, but the specifics remain mysterious. Modern neuroscience has identified some principles that might apply. Brain function depends on the number of neurons, yes, but also on how they're connected. The human brain contains approximately 86 billion neurons, but what makes it powerful isn't just the quantity, it's the density of connections, the efficiency of neural networks, and the specialization of different brain regions. In principle, you could reduce total neuron count while maintaining function if you optimized connections, eliminated less critical functions, and streamlined processing. The Floresiensis brain seems to have done exactly that. But which functions did they sacrifice? What cognitive abilities did they lose in the miniaturization process? And what remained intact? Language is the key question. Modern human language is arguably our most distinctive cognitive trait, more important even than tool-making. It requires syntactic processing, the ability to combine words according to grammatical rules. It requires semantic understanding, the mapping of sounds to meanings. It requires phonological memory, the ability to remember and reproduce complex sound sequences. And it requires social cognition, the ability to understand that other individuals have minds and intentions. All of this demands extensive neural machinery, but the enlarged temporal lobes in Floresiensis suggest they had at least some capacity for auditory processing and perhaps rudimentary language. Maybe not full modern human language with complex grammar and abstract vocabulary, but perhaps a simpler communication system, a proto-language with basic words and simple combinations, enough to coordinate hunting, share information about tool-making, and transmit knowledge across generations. Tool manufacture itself provides evidence for cognitive complexity beyond what brain size would suggest. Making a stone tool requires understanding that striking a rock at the correct angle will detach a flake with a sharp edge. This is causal reasoning, the comprehension of cause and effect relationships. It requires mental simulation, the ability to imagine the outcome of an action before performing it. It requires motor planning, the precise control of hand movements to strike at exactly the right spot with exactly the right force. And learning tool-making from others requires imitation, observation, and social learning. All of these are advanced cognitive abilities that supposedly require large, complex brains. Yet the hobbits did it with brains the size of chimpanzees, who despite decades of training rarely if ever manufacture stone tools in captivity and never do so in the wild. The hunting evidence adds another layer. Cooperative hunting requires coordination, communication, and role assignment. Someone has to track the prey. Someone has to drive it toward an ambush point. Someone has to deliver the killing blow. and everyone has to understand the plan and execute their role. This level of social cooperation appears in chimpanzees, yes, but rarely with the complexity seen in human hunting. The presence of juvenile stegodon remains at Liang Bua suggests the hobbits targeted specific age classes, probably because juveniles were easier to kill than adults. This is strategic thinking, the selection of appropriate prey based on capability and risk assessment. It's the kind of decision-making that requires executive function, the planning and control processes mediated by the prefrontal cortex. Fire use, if it occurred, would be even more cognitively demanding. Maintaining fire requires understanding that fuel must be added, that fire dies without attention, that certain materials burn better than others. Using fire for cooking requires understanding that heat transforms food, making it softer and easier to digest. None of this is instinctive. It all has to be learned, remembered, and passed on through social transmission. The evidence for fire at Liang Bua remains debated, with some burned materials potentially resulting from natural events rather than controlled use. But if the hobbits did control fire, it would demonstrate yet another sophisticated behavior from a species with a brain supposedly too small to support such complexity. So we're left with a mystery that conventional neuroscience cannot explain. A species with a brain 1/3 the size of modern humans, comparable to an ape, demonstrating cognitive abilities that supposedly require much larger brains, making complex tools, hunting cooperatively, possibly using language, potentially controlling fire, surviving successfully on an island for hundreds of thousands of years, not just surviving, but thriving, maintaining a stable population, passing knowledge between generations, adapting to environmental changes, all with 420 cubic centimeters of neural tissue. This shouldn't be possible according to everything we thought we knew about the relationship between brain size and intelligence. But it happened. The evidence is undeniable, which means our understanding of brains, of intelligence, of what's possible with neural tissue, is fundamentally incomplete. The implications extend far beyond Homo floresiensis. If small brains can support complex cognition through neural reorganization, then intelligence isn't strictly a function of size. It's a function of organization, efficiency, and architecture. This matters for artificial intelligence research, where creating smaller, more efficient neural networks remains a critical challenge. It matters for understanding human evolution because it suggests multiple pathways to intelligence rather than a single trajectory toward bigger brains. And it matters for appreciating the diversity of life because it reveals that nature can solve the problem of intelligence in radically different ways, that there's no single blueprint, no inevitable path, no predestined outcome. The hobbits proved that evolution can miniaturize intelligence, that big brains aren't necessary for sophisticated behavior, that the universe of possible minds is far larger and stranger than we ever imagined. Standing 1 meter tall, with brains the size of grapefruits, they accomplished what should have been impossible. And in doing so, they revealed how little we truly understand about consciousness, cognition, and the nature of thought itself. Flores Island sits approximately 300 kilometers east of Java across open ocean. Today, the Wallace Line, an invisible biogeographical boundary dividing Asian and Australian fauna, runs through the Indonesian archipelago west of Flores. This line marks the edge of the continental shelf, where deep ocean trenches separate islands that were never connected by land bridges, even during ice ages when sea levels dropped more than 100 meters below current levels, which means that for the past several million years, no land mammal could have walked to Flores. They would have had to cross water. Deep water. Dangerous water. Water filled with currents strong enough to drown the strongest swimmer. Water patrolled by sharks and saltwater crocodiles. Water separating islands by distances that no primate should have been able to traverse. Yet somehow, more than 700,000 years ago, hominins reached Flores and established a population that would survive until 50,000 years ago. How did they do it? This question haunts every researcher who studies Homo floresiensis, because the answer challenges everything we thought we understood about early human capabilities. The earliest evidence of hominin presence on Flores predates the Homo floresiensis fossils by hundreds of thousands of years. Stone tools discovered at the Mata Menga site in the Soa Basin of central Flores date to approximately 1 million years ago. These tools, simple flakes struck from volcanic cobbles, represent the oldest definite evidence of hominins on the island. The geological context is clear. These weren't deposited by rivers flowing from elsewhere. They weren't carried by later inhabitants and accidentally mixed with older sediments. They were manufactured on Flores by hominins who were present 1 million years ago, which means the crossing happened at least that long ago, possibly earlier if we simply haven't found the oldest sites yet. 1 million years ago, the hominin species dominating Asia was Homo erectus, tall, relatively large-brained, capable toolmaker, successful hunter, but also supposedly limited in cognitive capacity, lacking the abstract thinking and planning abilities of modern humans. Did they have boats? Almost certainly not. Did they have rafts? No evidence suggests they did. So how did they cross? The most conservative explanation invokes accident. Natural disasters, particularly tsunamis, can move large objects and living creatures across significant distances. Indonesia sits on the Pacific Ring of Fire, one of the most tectonically active regions on Earth. Volcanic eruptions trigger tsunamis. Earthquakes generate massive waves. These events destroy coastal habitats, uproot vegetation, and create floating debris mats of tangled trees, vegetation, and soil that can persist for days drifting on ocean currents. Animals trapped on these natural rafts can survive the journey, arriving on distant shores disoriented but alive. This phenomenon, called rafting dispersal, explains how many species colonized islands across the world. Monkeys reached South America from Africa this way approximately 35 million years ago. Rodents colonized the Caribbean islands multiple times via rafting. Even elephants appear to have reached Mediterranean islands during the Pleistocene by swimming between islands or riding debris flows. But rafting dispersal requires extraordinary luck. First, individuals have to be in exactly the right place when disaster strikes, close enough to shore to get swept away, but in a location where debris accumulates into a floating platform. Second, they have to survive the initial event without drowning or being crushed. Third, the raft has to remain intact during days of drift, not breaking apart in rough seas or being capsized by waves. Fourth, ocean currents have to carry the raft toward land rather than out to the open ocean. Fifth, the raft has to reach shore in a location where survivors can actually get off and find food and water. And sixth, you need at least a few individuals to survive, ideally including fertile females, to establish a breeding population. The odds against any single individual making this journey are astronomically high. The odds of enough individuals arriving to found a population are almost impossibly low. Yet it happened. At least once. Possibly multiple times across hundreds of thousands of years. Some researchers propose a slightly less dramatic scenario. Instead of single catastrophic events, they suggest multiple smaller crossings over extended time periods. During Ice Age low sea stands, the distance between islands decreased. What is now 300 kilometers of open ocean might have been reduced to 250 kilometers, with additional small islands or shallow banks visible between larger land masses. Homo erectus populations on Java might have occupied coastal areas where they could see Flores in the distance during clear weather. Over thousands of years, small groups might have attempted to reach visible land using simple watercraft. Logs lashed together with vines, bundles of bamboo tied into crude rafts, even just clinging to floating debris while kicking toward distant shores. Most attempts would fail. Most individuals would drown. But over millennia, a few might succeed. This scenario requires attributing more cognitive sophistication to Homo erectus than traditionally assumed. They would need to conceive of travel across water. They would need to plan the journey and construct flotation devices. They would need to understand that land exists beyond the horizon and that reaching it is possible. This pushes erectus capabilities into territory usually reserved for later, larger-brained species like Neanderthals and modern humans. The 2016 discovery of 700,000-year-old hominin fossils at Mata Menga added crucial data to this puzzle. The fossils, including a tiny adult jawbone and several teeth, belonged to hominins that were already small-bodied, similar in size to later Homo floresiensis. This established that the dwarfing process occurred very early, within 300,000 years of the initial colonization around 1 million years ago. More importantly, it meant that whatever ancestral population crossed to Flores must have done so before 700,000 years ago. The ancestral group was probably normal-sized Homo erectus, with adult males standing 160 to 170 centimeters tall and weighing 60 to 70 kilograms. After arrival, evolution began shrinking them rapidly. Within 300,000 years, they had reduced to approximately 1 meter in height and 25 kilograms in weight. This is astonishingly fast evolution, far quicker than most documented cases of mammalian size change. The speed of this transformation tells us something about the selective pressures on Flores. Island dwarfism, the tendency for large species to evolve smaller body size on islands, results from predictable environmental factors. Islands typically have fewer predators than mainlands, reducing the advantage of large body size for defense. They also have limited food resources, making smaller body size advantageous because smaller animals require less food. And they often have reduced competition, with fewer species occupying ecological niches, allowing generalist species to thrive without specialization. All of these factors apply to Flores. The island had no large carnivores, only Komodo dragons and large monitor lizards. Food resources, particularly during dry seasons, were probably limited, and species diversity was low compared to Java or other large land masses. Under these conditions, natural selection strongly favored smaller body size. Individuals who matured at smaller sizes reached reproductive age faster, had more offspring over their lifetimes, and survived better during food shortages. Over generations, the population mean shifted downward. But body size wasn't the only thing changing. Brain size shrank in parallel, dropping from Homo erectus averages of 850 to 1,100 cubic centimeters down to the 420 cubic centimeters seen in Homo floresiensis. This created the paradox discussed earlier. In most mammals, brain size scales with body size according to predictable allometric relationships. As body size decreases, brain size decreases too, but not proportionally. Smaller mammals have proportionally larger brains than larger mammals, a pattern called negative allometry. When scientists apply standard allometric scaling to the Floresiensis body size, they predict a brain size around 600 to 700 cubic centimeters. Instead, the actual brain size was 420 cubic centimeters, significantly smaller than predicted. This suggests that brain size was under independent selective pressure, that evolution was actively reducing brain size beyond what body size reduction alone would require. Why would selection favor smaller brains? The most compelling explanation involves energetics. Brains are metabolically expensive, consuming approximately 20% of the body's total energy budget in humans, despite representing only 2% of body weight. In an island environment with limited food, this energy cost becomes a serious burden. Individuals with smaller, more efficient brains would need less food, survive famines better, and reproduce more successfully. Over generations, brain size would decrease not because intelligence was unnecessary, but because the metabolic cost of maintaining large brains exceeded the benefits. This raises the disturbing question of what was lost. Did Floresiensis have reduced cognitive abilities compared to their erectus ancestors? Did language capacity diminish? Did abstract thinking become more limited? Or did neural reorganization allow them to maintain function despite size reduction, as the tool and hunting evidence suggests? The answer probably involves trade-offs. Some cognitive abilities were likely reduced: complex planning, large working memory capacity, extensive social networks. All of these might have suffered as brain size decreased. But essential functions, tool-making, hunting coordination, basic communication, were preserved through neural reorganization. The brain became more efficient, doing more with less, eliminating redundant circuits and optimizing critical pathways. This wouldn't be pleasant for the individuals experiencing it. Evolution doesn't care about comfort or potential. It cares only about survival and reproduction. If smaller brains allowed more offspring to survive to maturity, then smaller brains would become fixed in the population, regardless of what cognitive abilities were sacrificed. The predator situation on Flores probably influenced this evolution significantly. The island lacked large mammalian carnivores like tigers, leopards, or wolves that terrorized mainland Asia. The main predators were Komodo dragons, giant monitor lizards reaching 3 meters in length and capable of killing prey much larger than themselves. But Komodo dragons are ambush predators, not pursuit hunters. They rely on surprise and a venomous bite that causes prey to weaken over hours or days. An alert hominin group with tools and fire, if they had it, could defend against Komodo dragons reasonably effectively. This relaxed predation pressure reduced selective advantages of large body size for defense. It also reduced the advantages of large group size for protection, potentially allowing Floresiensis to live in smaller social groups. And smaller social groups might have reduced the need for large brains capable of tracking complex social relationships. The prey species on Flores had also undergone island evolution. Stegodon florensis, a dwarf elephant species, stood only 1.5 meters at the shoulder, dramatically smaller than mainland elephants. Giant rats, Flores mice, and various reptiles provided additional food sources. All of these were novel prey compared to what Homo erectus encountered on Java. Hunting them required learning new behaviors, developing new strategies, adapting tools and techniques to different anatomies and behaviors. This should have favored intelligence and behavioral flexibility. Yet it occurred during a period when brain size was shrinking. The paradox resolves only if we accept that the Floresiensis brain, while smaller, remained functionally adequate for the ecological challenges they faced. Perhaps even optimally sized, not too large to be metabolically expensive, but large enough to support the cognition necessary for survival. The isolation of Flores meant that the Floresiensis lineage evolved independently for hundreds of thousands of years. No gene flow from mainland populations influenced their trajectory. No new technology or behaviors were imported from elsewhere. Everything they became through their own evolutionary path, shaped by the specific pressures of their island environment. This makes them a natural experiment, a test case showing what happens when a relatively advanced hominin population adapts to extreme resource limitation and ecological isolation. The result was miniaturization, both of body and brain, but without complete cognitive collapse. They became smaller, simpler, more streamlined. But they remained human. They remained tool makers, hunters, social creatures capable of cooperation and learning, just dramatically reduced in scale, like a functional model, like evolution's proof that intelligence doesn't require size. The impossible journey that brought their ancestors to Flores initiated one of the strangest chapters in human evolution. And the creatures that resulted challenge every assumption about what forms human intelligence can take. The process that transformed normal-sized Homo erectus into meter-tall Homo floresiensis represents one of the most dramatic evolutionary changes ever documented in the human lineage. And it happened with shocking speed, in geological terms at least, fast enough to challenge our understanding of how quickly natural selection can reshape a species. The timeline tells the story. Hominins arrived on Flores approximately 1 million years ago based on stone tool evidence from Mata Menga. By 700,000 years ago, fossil evidence shows they had already shrunk to approximately the same diminutive size as the later Floresiensis specimens. This means the entire transformation from a 160 centimeter tall erectus weighing 60 kilograms to 106 centimeter tall hobbits weighing 25 kilograms occurred in roughly 300,000 years. 300,000 years sounds like a long time, but in evolutionary terms, it's astonishingly rapid. Most mammal species show relative stasis over such timescales, with body size remaining fairly constant. Major size changes typically require millions of years. Yet here, in less than a third of a million years, human body size was cut nearly in half. The mechanism behind this transformation is called island dwarfism, a well-documented phenomenon affecting many species that colonize islands. Large mammals on islands face predictable selective pressures that favor size reduction. Food resources are limited compared to mainlands, making smaller body size advantageous because smaller animals need fewer calories to survive. Predator pressure is typically reduced or absent on islands, eliminating the defensive advantages of large size. And competition is often less intense, allowing smaller individuals to access resources that would be monopolized by larger competitors on mainlands. These factors combine to create strong directional selection towards smaller body size. Over generations, the population mean shifts downward. Individuals who mature at smaller sizes reproduce earlier and more frequently. Their offspring inherit genes promoting smaller adult size. And gradually, sometimes rapidly, the entire population shrinks. Island dwarfism has produced dramatic size reductions in many mammal lineages. Dwarf elephants evolved on Mediterranean islands, shrinking from the multi-ton mainland elephants to species as small as 200 kilograms, barely larger than a large pig. Dwarf hippos appeared on Madagascar and various Mediterranean islands. Dwarf deer evolved in Japan. Even recently, in historical times, ponies and cattle introduced to isolated islands by humans have shown measurable size reduction within just a few hundred years. So the phenomenon is real, well-documented, and operates on timescales ranging from centuries to hundreds of thousands of years, depending on selective pressure intensity and generation time. Homo floresiensis fits this pattern perfectly. They evolved on an isolated island with limited resources and reduced predation. Size reduction was inevitable. But the Floresiensis case includes a twist that makes it unique among documented examples of island dwarfism. In most species, brain size scales with body size according to predictable allometric relationships. When a species gets smaller, its brain gets smaller too, but proportionally less so. This is called negative allometry. A mouse has a proportionally larger brain than an elephant, even though the elephant's absolute brain size is far greater. When scientists applied standard allometric scaling predictions to Homo floresiensis body size, they calculated that the brain should have been approximately 600 to 700 cubic centimeters. Instead, it was 420 cubic centimeters, dramatically smaller than predicted. This suggests that brain size was under independent selective pressure beyond what body size reduction alone would produce. Evolution was actively shrinking the brain, not just allowing it to scale down with body size. Why would natural selection favor smaller brains beyond the expected allometric relationship? The answer involves energy. Brains are metabolically expensive organs. In modern humans, the brain consumes roughly 20% of total energy expenditure, despite representing only 2% of body weight. For early hominins with less efficient energy extraction from food, the proportion might have been even higher. On an island with limited and unpredictable food resources, this energy cost becomes a serious burden. During seasonal food shortages or multi-year droughts, individuals with smaller, more efficient brains would have significant survival advantages. They could maintain body condition on less food. They could survive famines that killed larger-brained competitors. They could reach reproductive maturity faster and produce more offspring over their lifetimes. Over thousands of generations, these advantages would drive brain size downward independent of body size changes. But reducing brain size creates a cognitive dilemma. If smaller brains mean reduced cognitive capacity, then selection for smaller brains should eventually degrade the behavioral complexity that made the species successful in the first place. Tool-making would become harder. Hunting coordination would break down. Social learning would fail. The population would enter a death spiral of cognitive decline, leading to extinction. That Homo floresiensis avoided this fate for hundreds of thousands of years proves that they maintained adequate cognitive function despite dramatic brain size reduction. But how? What was preserved and what was lost? And what does this tell us about the relationship between brain size and intelligence? Recent research published in 2025 provided crucial insights into the developmental mechanisms of Floresiensis size reduction. By analyzing growth patterns in teeth and bones, researchers discovered that the hobbits didn't simply mature at smaller sizes. Instead, they evolved slower growth rates during childhood and adolescence, extending the juvenile period and delaying maturity while reaching smaller final adult sizes. This is called neoteny, the retention of juvenile characteristics into adulthood. It's the opposite of the accelerated growth pattern seen in Homo erectus and modern humans, where childhood is relatively brief and maturity arrives quickly. The Floresiensis growth pattern resembles that of great apes more than modern humans, with slower development and later first reproduction. This developmental strategy has profound implications for understanding how Floresiensis maintained cognitive function with smaller brains. Slower development allows more time for brain organization and neural network formation, even with fewer total neurons. Extended childhood provides more time for social learning and skill acquisition. And neoteny tends to preserve juvenile characteristics, including behavioral flexibility and learning capacity into adulthood. So even though the adult Floresiensis brain was tiny, it might have been structured more like a juvenile human brain, retaining plasticity and adaptability that partially compensated for reduced total capacity. This wouldn't make them as cognitively capable as adult humans with full-sized brains, but it might explain why they could still make tools, hunt cooperatively, and maintain cultural traditions despite having brains the size of chimpanzees who cannot do any of these things. The fossil evidence from Mata Menga, dating to 700,000 years ago, shows that the dwarfing process was essentially complete by that point. The jaw and teeth from Mata Menga belonged to an individual approximately the same size as later Floresiensis specimens. This means that for 650,000 years, from 700,000 years ago until their extinction around 50,000 years ago, the hobbits maintained a stable body size around 1 meter tall. They didn't continue shrinking, they didn't reverse course and grow larger again. They reached an optimal size for their environment and stayed there for more than 500,000 years. This stability suggests that they had achieved an adaptive equilibrium, a body and brain size that balanced energetic costs against functional requirements perfectly for survival on Flores. During this enormous time span, the Floresiensis population faced numerous challenges. Climate fluctuated repeatedly as ice ages came and went, sea levels rose and fell, and monsoon patterns shifted. Volcanic eruptions periodically devastated parts of the island, destroying habitats and killing prey species. Competitors and predators, including the giant Komodo dragons and enormous storks, contested for resources. Yet the hobbits persisted, maintaining their diminutive size, manufacturing their stone tools, hunting their dwarf elephants, and passing their knowledge across hundreds of thousands of generations. This is success by any evolutionary measure. Most mammal species last only 1,000,000 years or so before going extinct or evolving into something different. Homo floresiensis made it through 650,000 years as a distinct, stable, successful population. They were adapted, they were surviving, they were, in their own way, thriving. The archaeological record provides glimpses of their lives during this vast time span. Stone tools appear in layers spanning from over 1,000,000 years ago to approximately 50,000 years ago, showing continuous occupation with some technological changes over time. The oldest tools are simple flakes, basic cutting implements struck from volcanic cobbles. Later tools show more sophisticated shaping, with some implements showing careful retouching to create specific edge angles. This suggests technological evolution, cumulative cultural change passed through generations, improving and adapting tool designs over hundreds of thousands of years. Such cultural evolution requires social learning, teaching and imitation, communication about techniques and methods. It requires intelligence, memory, and the capacity to recognize that one method works better than another. All with a 420 cubic centimeter brain. The faunal remains associated with Floresiensis fossils reveal their diet and hunting strategies. Stegodon bones show cut marks from stone tools, proving that the hobbits butchered these dwarf elephants. The presence of both juvenile and adult stegodon remains suggests they could kill either age class, though juveniles were probably preferred as easier targets. Giant rat bones appear frequently in the archaeological deposits, many showing burning, suggesting the rats were cooked and eaten. Bird bones, reptile bones, and occasional fish remains round out the dietary evidence. This is an omnivorous, opportunistic diet exploiting multiple food sources, exactly the pattern expected for an intelligent, flexible forager. Not specialized on one prey type, not limited to easy-to-catch foods, but hunting, scavenging, gathering, and eating whatever the environment provided. The absence of large prey beyond stegodon suggests that Floresiensis hunting capabilities had limits. They apparently didn't hunt adult Komodo dragons, though dragons probably occasionally killed hobbits. They didn't exploit marine resources extensively, despite living on an island, suggesting limited coastal foraging. They didn't hunt the giant storks, though storks were present and probably vulnerable to coordinated hunting. This might reflect cognitive limits imposed by small brain size, or it might simply reflect abundance. If rats and juvenile stegodons were plentiful, there was no need to develop dangerous new hunting techniques for marginal gains. Evolution favors efficiency. If existing strategies provided adequate nutrition, there was no selective pressure to innovate further. But the most remarkable aspect of the Floresiensis evolutionary story isn't what they did during their 650,000 years of success. It's what happened at the end. Around 50,000 years ago, they vanished from the archaeological record. The youngest Floresiensis fossils date to approximately 60,000 years ago, the youngest stone tools to about 50,000 years ago. And then nothing. No more hobbits, no more tools, no more evidence of their existence. Complete absence where there had been continuous presence for nearly 1,000,000 years. The timing is suspicious. Modern humans reached Southeast Asia around 60,000 to 50,000 years ago. Human remains and tools appear on Flores shortly after the last Floresiensis evidence disappears. The correlation suggests causation. We arrived. They vanished. Just like Neanderthals. Just like Denisovans. Just like every other human species that encountered Homo sapiens. We were the end of them. Not through intentional genocide necessarily, but through competition, through resource depletion, through the introduction of new diseases, through the disruption of ecosystems too fragile to withstand our invasive presence. The fastest shrinking act in human evolutionary history, the dramatic miniaturization that allowed Floresiensis to survive for 650,000 years, couldn't save them from us. Evolution made them smaller, more efficient, perfectly adapted to their island home. But it couldn't make them resilient against modern human arrival. And in the end, adaptation wasn't enough. Every species has an origin story, a pathway through time connecting it to ancestral forms. For Homo floresiensis, that origin story remains frustratingly unclear despite 2 decades of research and debate. The fundamental question haunts every discussion of the hobbits. Where did they come from? Who were their ancestors? And where do they fit in the tangled bush of human evolution? The answers matter because they reveal how flexible human evolution can be, how many different forms humanity has taken, and how little we truly understand about our own family tree. 3 major hypotheses compete to explain Floresiensis origins, and each one challenges established ideas about human evolution in different ways. The first and most widely accepted hypothesis proposes that Homo floresiensis descended from Homo erectus populations that reached Southeast Asia approximately 1.5 million years ago. Homo erectus was the first hominin species to spread widely beyond Africa, colonizing much of Asia and establishing populations from Georgia to Java. These were successful, adaptable humans with brains averaging 850 to 100 cubic centimeters, standing 150 to 170 centimeters tall, manufacturing sophisticated stone tools, and possibly controlling fire. Erectus fossils from Java date back over 1 million years, proving their presence in the region during the time frame when hominins first reached Flores. The erectus to Floresiensis hypothesis suggests that a population of Javanese erectus somehow crossed to Flores, became isolated, and underwent rapid island dwarfing. Within 300,000 years, they shrank from erectus dimensions to hobbit dimensions, losing approximately 40% of their body height and 70% of their brain volume. This hypothesis fits the biogeographical evidence well. The timing works, the geography makes sense, and island dwarfing is a well-documented phenomenon that could explain the size reduction. But the magnitude of brain reduction creates problems. When researchers model expected brain size based on body size reduction using standard allometric scaling, they calculate that a dwarfed erectus should have a brain around 600 to 700 cubic centimeters, not 420. This means that brain size decreased beyond what body scaling alone would predict, suggesting independent selective pressure specifically reducing brain size. Such extreme brain reduction is unprecedented in primate evolution. No other documented case shows a hominin species losing 60% of ancestral brain volume while maintaining complex tool-making abilities. The Floresiensis brain, at 420 cubic centimeters, is smaller than any Homo erectus brain, smaller than Homo habilis brains, smaller even than late Australopithecus brains. If erectus is the ancestor, then something extraordinary happened during the dwarfing process, something that completely reorganized neural architecture to maintain function despite catastrophic size loss. Detailed analyses of the LB1 skull provide some support for the erectus hypothesis. Certain cranial features, including the structure of the eye orbits, the shape of the nasal opening, and aspects of the jaw, show similarities to Asian Homo erectus specimens. The teeth, while small, share morphological characteristics with erectus teeth, and the overall body proportions, though dramatically reduced in scale, retain some erectus-like features, including relatively long arms and robust leg bones. Statistical analyses comparing cranial measurements sometimes cluster Floresiensis closer to erectus than to other hominin species, but the tiny brain size remains the major obstacle. Explaining how erectus with an 850 to 1,100 cubic centimeter brain could evolve into Floresiensis with a 420 cubic centimeter brain while maintaining tool-making capability requires invoking neural reorganization so extreme that it has no parallel in primate evolution. This doesn't make the hypothesis wrong. It just makes it difficult to explain mechanistically. The second major hypothesis proposes a radically different origin story. Instead of descending from relatively advanced Asian Homo erectus, this hypothesis suggests that Floresiensis descended from a much more primitive ancestor, possibly Homo habilis or even late Australopithecus species. These were the earliest members of the Homo genus, living in Africa between 2.5 and 1.5 million years ago, with brain sizes ranging from 500 to 700 cubic centimeters and bodies not much larger than later Floresiensis. If one of these primitive species left Africa earlier than currently recognized, reached Southeast Asia over 1 million years ago, and colonized Flores, then they would have started small. The subsequent evolution to Floresiensis body size would require less dramatic dwarfing, and the small brain size would be explained by retention of primitive ancestral characteristics rather than extreme reduction from a larger erectus brain. This hypothesis solves the brain size problem elegantly. A habilis ancestor with a 600 cubic centimeter brain dwarfing to 420 cubic centimeters requires much less extreme reduction than an erectus ancestor with an 850 cubic centimeter brain. The arithmetic works better. The allometric scaling works better. And some features of the Floresiensis skeleton, particularly the foot structure and shoulder morphology, appear more primitive than erectus, potentially supporting an even earlier ancestral split. But this hypothesis creates a massive problem with the fossil record. There is no evidence, none whatsoever, of Homo habilis or Australopithecus ever leaving Africa. Every fossil of these species comes from African sites. The earliest confirmed hominin presence in Asia is Homo erectus around 1.8 million years ago. For the primitive ancestor hypothesis to work, a completely unknown migration of primitive hominins must have occurred, leaving no fossil trace across thousands of kilometers of Asia, somehow reaching islands that even Erectus struggled to colonize. This requires invoking a ghost population, an entire lineage of early humans that somehow remained invisible to paleontology for over a century of fossil hunting. Not impossible, but deeply unsatisfying without direct evidence. The third hypothesis, less widely discussed but still viable, suggests that Floresiensis represents a sister lineage to Homo erectus, descended from a common ancestor but diverging before Erectus fully evolved. This would place Floresiensis origins somewhere between 1.5 and 2 million years ago, stemming from early Homo populations in Africa that possessed some Erectus-like features but hadn't yet developed the full Erectus package of traits. One branch of this ancestral population evolved into the Erectus forms we recognize from African and Asian fossils. Another branch, the one leading to Floresiensis, dispersed to Southeast Asia early and evolved in isolation, developing distinct characteristics including extreme size reduction. This hypothesis avoids the problem of explaining massive brain reduction from Erectus while not requiring completely primitive ancestors like habilis. But it has the same ghost lineage problem as the primitive ancestor hypothesis. Where are the fossils documenting this separate lineage? Where are the intermediate forms showing the transition from the common ancestor to Floresiensis? Without fossil evidence, the hypothesis remains speculative. All three origin hypotheses face challenges, but the Erectus to Floresiensis pathway remains most accepted because it requires the fewest unsupported assumptions. It invokes only known species in known locations at documented times. The brain size problem is severe, yes, but perhaps not insurmountable if neural reorganization was more plastic than currently understood. Recent discoveries have added crucial data to this debate. The 2024 publication of fossils from Mata Menga dating to 700,000 years ago showed that the dwarfing process was complete relatively early. The Mata Menga hominins were already small-bodied, already Floresiensis-sized, 700,000 years ago. This pushes the transformation back in time and suggests that for the vast majority of their existence on Flores, the hobbits maintained stable body size. They weren't continuously shrinking, they reached an adaptive optimum and stayed there. Even more intriguing are hints of additional hominin species in the region. Stone tools over 1 million years old on Flores predate the oldest Floresiensis fossils, suggesting that whoever first reached the island might have been a different species or population. And on the nearby island of Sulawesi, stone tools dating to approximately 1 million years ago have been discovered without any associated hominin fossils. Were these made by Floresiensis ancestors? By Erectus populations that never dwarfed? Or by yet another unknown hominin species? The Southeast Asian island chain during the Middle Pleistocene may have hosted multiple hominin populations, each evolving in isolation, each adapting to local conditions in different ways. Flores might not have been unique. There might have been hobbits, or something like them, on other islands. The 2019 discovery of Homo luzonensis in the Philippines reinforces this possibility. Luzonensis, found on Luzon Island, dates to approximately 67,000 years ago and shows some similar characteristics to Floresiensis. Small body size, curved finger and toe bones suggesting climbing ability, primitive features mixed with derived traits. The Philippines, like Flores, are islands that required water crossings to reach. The presence of another small-bodied, primitive-featured hominin on another Southeast Asian island suggests that island dwarfing and evolutionary experimentation in isolated populations might have been common in the region. Southeast Asia during the Middle and Late Pleistocene wasn't dominated by a single hominin species. It was a patchwork of isolated populations, each on its own evolutionary trajectory, each solving survival problems in locally optimal ways. Floresiensis was part of this broader pattern, one example among potentially many of how human evolution could diverge when populations became isolated on resource-limited islands. The question of Floresiensis ancestry also connects to larger debates about human evolutionary patterns. For most of the 20th century, paleoanthropology viewed human evolution as a ladder, a linear progression from primitive ancestors to modern humans, with each species representing a rung leading upward toward us. Australopithecus gave rise to Homo habilis. Habilis gave rise to Erectus. Erectus gave rise to archaic Homo sapiens. And archaic sapiens evolved into modern humans. Clean, linear, progressive. But discoveries over the past 30 years have shattered this model. We now know that human evolution was bushy, not ladder-like. Multiple hominin species coexisted at the same times. Lineages branched, diverged, sometimes interbred. There was no single pathway, no inevitable progression, no linear march toward modernity. Homo floresiensis exemplifies this bushiness. They weren't on the main line of human evolution. They were a side branch, an experiment, a population that diverged and evolved in isolation until they vanished. And they were probably one of many such experiments. The fact that we cannot yet definitively place Floresiensis on our family tree reveals how incomplete our knowledge remains. Despite decades of fossil hunting, despite advanced analytical techniques, despite extensive research, major gaps persist in the hominin fossil record. Most hominin species are known from only a handful of specimens. Most time periods are represented by few or no fossils from most regions. Entire continents, like Southeast Asia, have sparse fossil records compared to East Africa. This means that our current understanding of human evolution is based on fragmentary evidence from limited locations. We're mapping a vast continental landscape using scattered photographs taken from random points. We can see some features clearly, but enormous areas remain unmapped. Homo floresiensis emerged from one of those unmapped areas. Their ancestors, whoever they were, left insufficient fossil evidence to trace their journey. And until we find more fossils, more transitional forms, more pieces of the puzzle, the mystery of Hobbit origins will remain unsolved. What we know for certain is this: more than 700,000 years ago, hominins reached Flores. By 700,000 years ago, they had shrunk to Hobbit dimensions, and for 650,000 years they survived, thrived, and persisted on their island home despite having brains too small, bodies too weak, and capabilities too limited according to our theories of what humans should be. Their origin may be uncertain, but their success is undeniable. 50,000 years ago, the planet was inhabited by at least 4 distinct human species. We tend to think of ourselves, Homo sapiens, as the natural endpoint of evolution, the inevitable result of millions of years of natural selection. But for most of human history, we were not alone. We shared the world with cousins, relatives, sister species who looked different, thought differently, and survived in their own ways. And one by one, all of them vanished. Understanding this vanishing act requires stepping back and seeing the bigger picture of human diversity during the late Pleistocene. The picture is startling. Between 300,000 and 30,000 years ago, the human family was remarkably diverse. In Europe and Western Asia, Neanderthals dominated. They were stocky, muscular, cold-adapted humans with brains actually larger than modern human averages, ranging from 1,200 to 1,750 cubic centimeters. They controlled fire, created sophisticated stone tools, buried their dead with apparent ritual, made jewelry and art, and may have had complex language. They were successful, surviving for over 300,000 years through multiple ice ages and climate fluctuations. In the Altai Mountains of Siberia and probably scattered across Asia, Denisovans persisted. Known primarily from DNA extracted from a few bone fragments, Denisovans were a sister lineage to Neanderthals, equally mysterious and equally successful. Their DNA shows up in modern populations from Tibet to Papua New Guinea, proving they spread widely and interbred with Homo sapiens. In Southeast Asia, on the Indonesian island of Flores, Homo floresiensis survived in their caves, hunting dwarf elephants with their small brains and smaller bodies. And on Luzon Island in the Philippines, Homo luzonensis, discovered only in 2019, added another branch to the family tree, another example of island-isolated humans evolving in strange directions. All of these species coexisted with Homo sapiens. We originated in Africa approximately 300,000 years ago, based on the oldest fossils currently known from Morocco. For the first 200,000 years of our existence, we stayed mostly in Africa, spreading slowly across the continent, but not venturing far beyond. Then, around 70,000 to 60,000 years ago, something changed. Modern humans began expanding out of Africa, moving into the Middle East, then Asia, then Europe. And wherever we went, other human species began disappearing. The correlation is too strong to ignore. Neanderthals thrived in Europe for over 300,000 years. Modern humans arrived around 45,000 years ago. By 40,000 years ago, Neanderthal populations were declining. By 30,000 years ago, they were extinct. Denisovans showed a similar pattern. Homo floresiensis, surviving for at least 650,000 years on Flores, vanished around 50,000 years ago, exactly when modern humans reached Southeast Asia. The youngest Floresiensis fossils date to approximately 60,000 years ago. The youngest stone tools they made date to 50,000 years ago. And then silence. What happened? The simplest explanation is also the darkest. We killed them. Not necessarily through direct violence, though that certainly occurred, but through resource competition, through displacement from prime habitats, through the introduction of diseases to which they had no immunity, through the gradual erosion of population viability as we outcompeted them for food, territory, and survival. Modern humans weren't necessarily smarter than Neanderthals or Denisovans. Brain size comparisons don't favor us. But we had advantages in other areas. Population size, probably. Modern humans seem to have maintained larger social networks and bigger groups. Technology transfer. Our tools show more rapid innovation and improvement. Social organization. Our sites show evidence of more complex division of labor and specialization. These subtle advantages would compound over thousands of years. Slowly, relentlessly, we would push other species to the margins, to less productive habitats, to smaller territories. Their populations would fragment, genetic diversity would decline, and eventually they would pass a threshold beyond which recovery was impossible. Not with a bang, with a whimper. A dwindling population in an isolated valley. A final generation with too few members to sustain itself. And then absence. The timing of Floresiensis extinction fits this pattern disturbingly well. The youngest Floresiensis remains and tools date to approximately 50,000 years ago. Archaeological evidence shows modern humans reaching Australia by 65,000 to 50,000 years ago, which required passing through Southeast Asia and the Indonesian archipelago. The routes taken by these early sapiens migrations would have passed near or through Flores. Even if modern humans didn't settle on Flores immediately, their presence in the region would have disrupted ecosystems. They would have hunted the same prey species, stegodon elephants and giant rats, that Floresiensis depended on. They would have competed for cave sites and water sources. And they would have had technological advantages. Modern humans at this time period had more sophisticated weapons, better hunting strategies, and probably larger group sizes. Against such competition, the small-bodied, small-brained hobbits would have been at severe disadvantage. But there's another possibility, more subtle and perhaps even more devastating. Modern humans might have carried diseases to which Floresiensis had no immunity. Island populations, isolated for hundreds of thousands of years, are particularly vulnerable to introduced pathogens. When Europeans reached Pacific Islands in the 18th and 19th centuries, they brought smallpox, measles, influenza, and other diseases that decimated indigenous populations with no previous exposure. The death rates were catastrophic, sometimes exceeding 90%. A similar scenario with Floresiensis is entirely plausible. Modern humans arriving from continental Asia would carry parasites, bacteria, and viruses that had evolved in large, connected populations. Floresiensis, isolated on Flores for 650,000 years, would have evolved completely separate immune systems with no prior exposure to Asian pathogens. First contact could have been epidemiologically apocalyptic. A single infected modern human entering Floresiensis territory could trigger cascading disease spread that killed most of the population within months. The survivors, weakened and reduced in number, would be unable to sustain viable breeding populations. Within a few generations, extinction would be inevitable. Climate change provides a third potential factor. Around 50,000 years ago, the planet was experiencing significant climatic fluctuations. Sea levels were dropping as the last ice age intensified. Monsoon patterns were shifting. Vegetation zones were changing. For a species already living at the edge of viability, these environmental changes could have been catastrophic. Floresiensis had adapted to specific conditions on Flores, specific food sources, specific rainfall patterns, specific prey distributions. If climate change altered those conditions significantly, the hobbits might have been unable to adapt quickly enough. Their small population size would limit genetic variation available for selection. Their slow reproduction rate, with extended childhoods, would slow evolutionary responses. And their small geographic range, confined to a single island, would offer no escape to more favorable environments. Trapped on Flores as conditions deteriorated, they would face declining food availability, increasing environmental stress, and eventually, population collapse. Most likely, all three factors, competition with modern humans, introduced diseases, and climate change, combined to drive Floresiensis extinct. None alone might have been sufficient, but together they created an extinction vortex from which there was no escape. The competitive pressure from modern humans reduced population size and restricted range. This made the population more vulnerable to disease outbreaks, which further reduced numbers. Climate change stressed the remaining individuals, reducing reproductive success, and each factor amplified the others, creating a positive feedback loop spiraling toward extinction. This is how most extinctions occur. Not from a single catastrophic event, but from multiple stressors combining to push populations beyond their resilience capacity. The broader pattern of human extinctions during the late Pleistocene is impossible to ignore. At 300,000 years ago, at least 8 human species existed. By 30,000 years ago, only one remained, Homo sapiens. Every other species, Neanderthals, Denisovans, Floresiensis, Luzonensis, and others we may not have discovered yet, went extinct in the narrow window between 50,000 and 30,000 years ago. This is the exact period when Homo sapiens underwent rapid geographic expansion, spreading from Africa across Eurasia, reaching Australia and eventually the Americas. The correlation is undeniable. Before modern humans arrived, these species had survived for hundreds of thousands of years. After modern humans arrived, they vanished. We were the common factor. We were the change. We were, almost certainly, the cause. This should disturb us. It reveals something about our species that we prefer not to acknowledge. We are not peaceful. We are not harmless. Our expansion across the planet left a trail of extinctions, not just of megafauna like mammoths and giant sloths, but of our own relatives, other humans who thought and loved and struggled to survive just as we did. Whether through direct violence, indirect competition, disease introduction, or environmental disruption, the result was the same. They died, we survived, and now we live in a world where human diversity has been reduced to a single species, a single solution, a single way of being human. But it didn't have to be this way. Imagine a world where Neanderthals still lived in Europe, where Floresiensis still hunted on Flores, where multiple human species shared the planet, each with their own cultures, their own technologies, their own ways of understanding existence. That world almost was. That world could have been. But our ancestors, your ancestors and mine, ensured it never would be. The extinction of Homo floresiensis around 50,000 years ago marks the end of their 650,000-year success story on Flores. They had survived climate changes, volcanic eruptions, predators, and resource limitations. They had evolved one of the most extreme adaptations in human evolutionary history, shrinking to hobbit dimensions while maintaining cognitive abilities that should have been impossible. They proved that evolution could miniaturize intelligence, that big brains weren't necessary for culture and technology, that human diversity could extend in directions we never imagined. And then they vanished. Not because they failed, not because they were unfit, but because they encountered us. And in that encounter they had no chance. The caves of Liangbois, where their bones were discovered, preserved their final moments, frozen in stone. Tools abandoned mid-manufacture. Hearths that would never be relit. Footprints leading nowhere. The silence of extinction is absolute. And in that silence, we confront an uncomfortable truth about who we are and what we've done. The village of Rampasasa sits in the Manggarai highlands of central Flores, approximately 40 kilometers from Liangbua Cave, where Homo floresiensis fossils were discovered. The people here maintain oral traditions stretching back through countless generations. And among those traditions, one story stands out with disturbing specificity. They speak of the Ebugogo, which translates roughly to grandmother who eats everything in the local language. These were small people, they say, standing barely taller than a child, covered in hair, living in caves in the forest. The Ebugogo had their own language, strange grunting sounds that humans couldn't understand, though they could mimic human speech like parrots without comprehension. They stole crops from gardens. They occasionally kidnapped children, though the children always escaped using their superior intelligence. And according to the legends, the last Ebugogo were killed by human villagers only a few hundred years ago, hunted down and burned alive in their caves. When archaeologists discovered Homo floresiensis in 2003, the parallels to the Ebugogo legends became impossible to ignore. Small stature matching the folklore descriptions, cave-dwelling habits confirmed by fossil evidence, existence on Flores documented through the archaeological record. Could the Ebugogo stories be cultural memory, oral history passed down through generations, preserving knowledge of real encounters between modern humans and the last surviving hobbit populations? Or were the similarities merely coincidence, stories invented to explain bones occasionally found in caves, retrofitted after the fossil discovery to seem prophetic? These questions cut to the heart of how we understand folklore, how reliably oral traditions preserve historical truth, and whether Homo floresiensis might have survived far longer than the 50,000-year-old extinction date suggested by fossils. The Ebugogo descriptions contain specific details that supporters of the historical memory hypothesis find compelling. The stories consistently describe them as approximately 1 meter tall, matching Floresiensis fossils precisely. They had flat noses and broad faces, matching reconstructions of hobbit facial structure. They walked oddly with a waddling gait, consistent with the unusual foot structure and body proportions revealed by skeletal analysis. The females supposedly had long, pendulous breasts that they threw over their shoulders, a bizarre detail that seems too specific to be casual invention. They were described as hairy, covered in reddish-brown body hair, though actual Floresiensis hairiness is unknown since soft tissue doesn't fossilize. And critically, they were described as having language, communication, social structure, not as animals, but as a different kind of people. These are not generic monster stories. These are detailed ethnographic descriptions of a distinct population with specific physical and behavioral characteristics. The timing elements of the Ebugogo legends raise the most controversial questions. According to some versions of the story, the final extermination occurred around the 1600s or 1700s, when Dutch traders were already visiting Indonesia. The story goes that villagers became fed up with Ebugogo thefts and decided to eliminate them permanently. They offered the Ebugogo bundles of palm fiber, supposedly for making clothes. The Ebugogo, pleased with the gift, took the fiber into their cave. Then the villagers threw torches into the cave, setting the fiber ablaze and burning the Ebugogo alive. Most died in the fire, but some versions claim a pair escaped into the forest, and their descendants might still survive in the remotest parts of Flores. If any of this is true, If Ebu Gogo stories preserve memories of actual events, then Homo floresiensis survived not until 50,000 years ago, but until historically recent times, potentially living alongside modern humans for tens of thousands of years. Most scientists reject this interpretation as wishful thinking. The youngest confirmed Floresiensis fossils date to approximately 60,000 years ago. The youngest stone tools attributable to them date to 50,000 years ago. No younger evidence has been found despite extensive searching. The gap between 50,000 years ago and a few centuries ago is enormous, 49,500 years of complete archaeological absence. No bones, no tools, no traces whatsoever. If Floresiensis survived that long, where is the evidence? Moreover, the specifics of the Ebu Gogo stories could easily have been invented or embellished after the fossil discovery, consciously or unconsciously shaped to match scientific findings. Memory is malleable. Oral traditions change over time, incorporating new information, adapting to new contexts. The precision of the match between Ebu Gogo descriptions and Floresiensis anatomy might simply reflect story evolution after 2003, not preservation of ancient truth. But the counter-arguments deserve consideration. The Ebu Gogo stories were collected and documented by anthropologists before the 2003 Floresiensis discovery. Gregory Forth, an anthropologist from the University of Alberta, had been recording Nage folklore from Central Flores since the 1980s. His published accounts of Ebu Gogo legends appeared in the 1990s, years before anyone knew Hobbit fossils existed on the island. These pre-discovery records cannot be dismissed as post hoc invention. The stories existed independently of scientific knowledge, and their specific details, the meter height, the flat faces, the odd gait, match Floresiensis characteristics that wouldn't be obvious from casual observation of bones. This suggests either extraordinary coincidence or genuine cultural memory. Similar stories appear in folklore across Indonesia and Southeast Asia, suggesting a broader pattern. The orang pendek of Sumatra, small hairy hominids supposedly living in remote forests, have been reported by local communities for centuries. The Philippine Islands have their own legends of small forest people, potentially corresponding to Homo luzonensis, discovered in 2019. Vietnam, Cambodia, and other mainland Southeast Asian countries have folklore about wild men, primitive people living in jungles, avoiding contact with civilization. Skeptics note that almost every culture has wild man legends, and most have been definitively proven false. Bigfoot in North America, Yeti in the Himalayas, Yowie in Australia, all unconfirmed despite centuries of reports. But in the case of Indonesian islands, we know archaic humans actually lived there recently in geological terms. The folklore might not be pure invention. It might be distorted memory, cultural recollection of encounters that actually occurred. The village of Rampasasa, where Ebu Gogo legends are strongest, has another connection to the Hobbit mystery. The people there are unusually short-statured, averaging under 150 centimeters in height compared to over 170 centimeters for most Indonesian populations. Could they be descendants of Homo floresiensis? Could interbreeding between modern humans and hobbits have occurred, leaving genetic traces in modern populations? This question drove a major research effort published in 2018 in the journal Science. Researchers sequenced complete genomes from 32 Rampasasa individuals, searching for any genetic signature of Hobbit ancestry. They used sophisticated analytical techniques to detect DNA from archaic hominins, the same methods that had successfully identified Neanderthal and Denisovan genetic contributions in modern populations. The results were definitive and disappointing. The Rampasasa people showed no evidence of genetic contribution from Homo floresiensis. None. Their genomes contained small amounts of Neanderthal DNA and approximately 0.8% Denisovan DNA, consistent with other Southeast Asian populations, but no unknown archaic hominin DNA that might represent Hobbit ancestry. The researchers had expected to find something, some signal, some trace. If Floresiensis and sapiens coexisted on Flores for any length of time, interbreeding seemed almost inevitable, given that we know sapiens interbred with Neanderthals and Denisovans. but the genetic analysis found nothing. Either Floresiensis went extinct before modern humans arrived, precluding contact, or contact occurred, but no interbreeding happened, or interbreeding occurred, but the genetic lineages carrying Floresiensis DNA didn't survive to the present. The genetic study did reveal why the Rampasasa people are so short. Their genomes showed high frequencies of genetic variants associated with reduced height, variants that exist in many human populations but are unusually common in Rampasasa. Natural selection acting on standing genetic variation, favoring shorter stature because of island resource limitations, explained their size without requiring Hobbit ancestry. They became short independently through the same evolutionary process that created Homo floresiensis, island dwarfism operating on modern human populations. Two separate dwarfing events on the same island, one producing the hobbits hundreds of thousands of years ago, another producing the Rampasasa pygmies within the last few thousand years. Parallel evolution, not shared ancestry. These genetic findings seem to eliminate the possibility of recent Floresiensis survival. If the hobbits lived until a few centuries ago, if the Ebu Gogo stories are literal truth, then modern Flores populations should carry hobbit DNA from inevitable interbreeding. The absence of such DNA suggests Floresiensis was already extinct when modern humans arrived, or at minimum went extinct so quickly after contact that no genetic mixing occurred. This pushes the Ebu Gogo legends back into the category of folklore rather than history. But it doesn't completely eliminate the mystery. Oral traditions can preserve memories for surprisingly long periods. Aboriginal Australian songlines accurately describe coastal geography that existed during ice ages when sea levels were lower, meaning some stories have been transmitted for over 10,000 years. If Floresiensis survived until 50,000 or even 40,000 years ago, and early modern humans encountered them, those encounters could have been remembered and retold through 2,000 generations, gradually transforming into the Ebu Gogo stories we hear today. The truth probably lies somewhere between literal history and pure invention. Modern humans likely did encounter Homo floresiensis when first arriving on Flores between 60,000 and 50,000 years ago. These encounters, brief and violent or extended and competitive, left impressions. Stories were told. Knowledge was passed down. Over tens of thousands of years, the stories changed, exaggerated, incorporated new elements, merged with other folklore. By the time anthropologists recorded them in the 20th century, the Ebu Gogo legends had transformed into something more mythological than historical. But beneath the embellishments, beneath the impossible details, a core truth might remain. Small people lived here once, different from us. They're gone now. We remember them. And in remembering, we acknowledge both what was lost and what we might have done. The Ebu Gogo legends, whether history or myth or something between, serve as memorial. A reminder that we once shared this planet with others who thought and spoke and struggled to survive. And they're gone. And we're here. And the connection between those two facts might be more direct than we're comfortable admitting. The discovery of Homo floresiensis in 2003 was just the beginning. Over the following 2 decades, additional excavations, technological advances in dating methods, and new fossil discoveries transformed our understanding of these mysterious hobbits. Each new finding added layers to the story, answering some questions while raising entirely new ones. The picture that emerged was far more complex, far stranger, and in some ways far more disturbing than the original discovery suggested. These weren't just unusual ancient humans who happened to be small. They were the product of one of the most dramatic evolutionary transformations in hominin history, and their extinction coincided suspiciously with the arrival of our own species in Southeast Asia. The first major revelation came in 2016 when the research team published a comprehensive redating of Liang Bua Cave using improved chronological techniques. The original 2004 publication had suggested that Floresiensis survived until approximately 12,000 years ago, making them contemporaneous with early agriculture and the end of the last ice age. If true, this would have been extraordinary, suggesting that tiny-brained hobbits lived alongside anatomically modern humans with agriculture, pottery, and complex technologies. But the 2016 redating demolished this timeline. Using thermoluminescence and uranium-thorium dating on the sediments and fossils themselves, the team determined that the youngest Floresiensis remains dated to approximately 60,000 to 100,000 years ago, not 12,000. The youngest stone tools attributable to them dated to approximately 50,000 years ago. After that date, nothing. Complete absence where there had been continuous occupation for over 100,000 years. This chronological revision had profound implications. It meant that Floresiensis went extinct around 50,000 years ago, exactly when modern humans were expanding through Southeast Asia. Archaeological evidence shows Homo sapiens reached Australia by 65,000 to 50,000 years ago, which required passing through the Indonesian archipelago. The timing was too precise to be coincidental. For hundreds of thousands of years, Floresiensis thrived on Flores. Then modern humans arrived in the region. Within a few thousand years, perhaps less, the hobbits disappeared. The same pattern had played out with Neanderthals in Europe. Modern humans arrived around 45,000 years ago. Neanderthals, who had dominated Europe for 300,000 years, were extinct by 30,000 years ago. Denisovans showed similar timing. Wherever Homo sapiens went, other human species vanished. The Floresiensis extinction fit this pattern perfectly. We were the common factor. We were the change that made their continued survival impossible. But the redating also answered another critical question. If Floresiensis went extinct 50,000 years ago rather than 12,000, then they couldn't possibly have been diseased modern humans, as some critics had argued. Modern humans didn't reach Flores until after Floresiensis had already disappeared. The pathology hypothesis, which claimed that LB1 was a modern human suffering from microcephaly, cretinism, or other growth disorders, collapsed completely. The dates made such interpretations impossible. Homo floresiensis was undeniably a distinct species, not a diseased variant of Homo sapiens. The timing separated them by at least 10,000 years from the first modern human arrival on the island. This was one of the most important confirmations from the 2016 study. It ended the debate over species status definitively. Homo floresiensis was real, distinct, and genuinely ancient. The second major discovery came in 2024 with the publication of new fossils from the Mata Menga site in central Flores. These remains, including an incredibly small adult mandible and several teeth, dated to approximately 700,000 years ago. They represented the oldest confirmed Homo floresiensis specimens ever found, predating the Liangbua remains by over 600,000 years. And critically, they showed that the dwarfing process was essentially complete by this early date. The Mata Menga individuals were already tiny, already hobbit-sized, 700,000 years ago. This meant that the evolutionary transformation from normal-sized Homo erectus, or whatever the ancestral species was, to miniature Floresiensis occurred in less than 300,000 years, between approximately 1 million years ago, when hominins first reached Flores, and 700,000 years ago, when the Mata Menga population existed. This was astonishingly rapid evolution, far faster than most mammalian-sized changes documented in the fossil record. The Mata Menga discoveries included what researchers called the smallest adult hominin arm bone ever discovered in the human fossil record. The humerus, the upper arm bone, measured just 14 centimeters long, about half the length of a modern human humerus. This confirmed that the entire skeleton was proportionally reduced, not just the skull and brain. Body size had dwindled to extraordinary degrees. The teeth from Mata Menga also showed interesting patterns. They were small, but not exceptionally so, maintaining relatively normal proportions despite overall body size reduction. This suggested that tooth size was under different selective pressures than body and brain size, constrained by functional requirements for chewing that couldn't be compromised even when everything else shrank. Another crucial finding from recent research involved understanding the developmental mechanisms behind Floresiensis size reduction. A 2025 study published in a major journal analyzed growth patterns in Floresiensis teeth and bones, comparing them to modern humans and other hominin species. The researchers discovered that Floresiensis evolved smaller body size through extended childhood development, a process called neoteny. Instead of growing quickly and reaching adult size early, Floresiensis juveniles grew slowly over extended periods, eventually maturing at much smaller final sizes than their ancestors. This developmental strategy had profound implications. Extended childhood allows more time for brain development and learning despite reduced overall brain size. It permits complex cognitive abilities to develop in smaller neural substrates, and it suggests that Floresiensis might have retained some juvenile characteristics into adulthood, including behavioral flexibility and learning capacity. The stone tool assemblages from Flores also received new attention. Detailed analysis of tools from multiple sites spanning hundreds of thousands of years revealed technological continuity with some gradual evolution. The oldest tools, dating to over 1 million years ago, were simple flakes struck from volcanic cobbles. Later tools showed more sophisticated shaping and retouching. But throughout the entire sequence, the basic technological strategy remained consistent. This suggested cultural continuity, knowledge transmission across generations, cumulative technological evolution over enormous time spans. It also suggested that Floresiensis cognitive abilities, while probably not equivalent to modern humans, were sufficient for cultural learning and incremental innovation. With brains 1/3 the size of ours, they maintained technological traditions for longer than modern humans have existed as a species. Comparative studies with other hominin sites in Southeast Asia revealed additional surprises. In 2019, researchers announced the discovery of Homo luzonensis from Luzon Island in the Philippines, dated to approximately 67,000 years ago. Luzonensis showed some similar characteristics to Floresiensis: small body size, curved finger and toe bones suggesting climbing ability, and a mix of primitive and derived features. The presence of another small-bodied hominin on another Southeast Asian island suggested that island dwarfing and evolutionary experimentation in isolated populations might have been common in the region. Southeast Asia during the Middle and Late Pleistocene wasn't dominated by a single hominin type. It was a mosaic of isolated populations, each evolving independently, each adapting to local conditions in unique ways. Stone tools over 1 million years old discovered on Sulawesi, the large island north of Flores, added another puzzle piece. These tools proved that hominins had reached multiple Indonesian islands very early, potentially before the Floresiensis lineage became isolated on Flores. Who made the Sulawesi tools? Homo erectus? Early Floresiensis ancestors? Another unknown hominin species? Without associated fossils, the identity remains uncertain. But the distribution of early stone tools across the archipelago suggests more complex migration patterns than simple one-way dispersals. Multiple colonization events, multiple hominin lineages, multiple evolutionary experiments occurring in parallel on different islands. The Indonesian archipelago during the Pleistocene was a laboratory of human evolution, with isolated populations diverging in different directions, some becoming larger, some smaller, all adapting to their specific island environments. Research into the extinction mechanisms also advanced significantly. Climate modeling showed that around 50,000 years ago, Flores experienced significant environmental changes. Monsoon patterns shifted, vegetation zones changed, prey animal distributions altered. These environmental stresses would have challenged Floresiensis populations already living at the edge of viability. Their small population size, confined to one island, meant limited genetic diversity and reduced capacity for adaptation. Their slow reproduction rate with extended childhoods meant slow population recovery from losses. And their specialized adaptation to Flores environments meant they couldn't easily shift to new strategies when conditions changed. These factors created vulnerability. Environmental stress alone might not have driven them extinct, but combined with the arrival of modern humans, the competitive pressure, and possibly introduced diseases, the cumulative effect became insurmountable. Floresiensis existed in an evolutionary dead end. perfectly adapted to specific conditions on Flores, but unable to survive when those conditions changed and new competitors arrived. The genetic research, though ultimately unsuccessful in extracting DNA from Floresiensis fossils, provided important negative evidence. The fossils from Liangbua, while relatively recent in geological terms at 60,000 to 100,000 years old, weren't fossilized in the traditional sense. They retained some organic material, described as having the consistency of wet blotting paper. This raised hopes that ancient DNA might be preserved. Multiple research teams attempted extraction using increasingly sophisticated techniques that had successfully recovered Neanderthal and Denisovan DNA from older fossils in cooler climates. But every attempt failed. The tropical conditions, high humidity, and temperature fluctuations in the cave had degraded DNA beyond recovery. This meant that genetic questions about Floresiensis ancestry, about their relationship to other hominin species, about possible interbreeding with modern humans, couldn't be answered through DNA analysis. The fossils themselves, the anatomical features, the archaeological context, these remained the only evidence available. And they told a story of remarkable adaptation, extreme evolution, and ultimately, extinction when conditions changed and we arrived. The existence of Homo floresiensis forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about intelligence, about brain size, and about the assumptions that have dominated neuroscience and anthropology for over a century. We've built entire theories of human evolution around the idea that bigger brains equal better minds. Encephalization, the increase in brain size relative to body size, has been presented as the defining trend of human evolution, the key innovation that made us special. From Australopithecus with brains around 450 cubic centimeters, to Homo habilis at 600 cubic centimeters, to Homo erectus at 850 to 1,100 cubic centimeters, to Neanderthals and modern humans at 1,200 to 1,750 cubic centimeters, the trajectory seemed clear. Bigger brains were better brains. More neurons meant more intelligence. Size mattered. Then we discovered a species with a 420 cubic centimeter brain who made sophisticated tools, hunted cooperatively, and survived successfully for 650,000 years. Everything we thought we understood about the relationship between brain size and cognitive capability suddenly became questionable. Modern neuroscience has documented strong correlations between brain size and intelligence within species. Humans with larger brains tend to score slightly higher on intelligence tests. Brain imaging studies show that certain cognitive abilities correlate with the size of specific brain regions. And across mammal species, larger-brained animals generally show more complex behaviors than smaller-brained relatives. These correlations aren't perfect. Brain organization matters as much as size, but the general pattern holds. Bigger brains have more neurons, more connections, more processing capacity. This should translate to better problem-solving, more flexible behavior, superior learning abilities. Yet Homo floresiensis violates this pattern spectacularly. With brains comparable to chimpanzees who cannot manufacture stone tools despite decades of training, the Hobbits created implement types that required planning, causal understanding, and technical skill. With brains one-third the size of modern humans, they maintained cultural traditions for longer than our species has existed. Something is profoundly wrong with our understanding. The answer involves neural reorganization, but the specifics remain mysterious and controversial. Brain function depends not just on the total number of neurons, but on how those neurons are organized, how they're connected, and what types of information processing they perform. The human brain contains approximately 86 billion neurons, but what makes it powerful isn't just quantity. It's the density of connections in the cerebral cortex. It's the specialization of different regions for different functions. It's the efficiency of neural networks that minimize wiring costs while maximizing information processing. In principle, you could maintain cognitive function while reducing total neuron count if you optimized these organizational features. You would sacrifice some capabilities, certainly. Total working memory capacity would decline. The number of concepts that could be held simultaneously would decrease. Processing speed for complex calculations would slow. But core functions, tool making, language comprehension, social learning, might survive if they were prioritized, and the neural architecture supporting them was preserved. Comparative neuroanatomy provides some clues about how this might work. The Floresiensis brain, reconstructed from the shape of the skull interior, shows disproportionately large temporal lobes relative to overall size. The temporal lobes process auditory information, language comprehension, and memory formation. Expanding these regions while shrinking everything else suggests a trade-off. Functions handled by the temporal lobes were maintained, perhaps even enhanced relative to other capabilities. This makes sense if Floresiensis had some form of language, even simple proto-language. Communication would be essential for cooperative hunting, for teaching tool-making techniques, for coordinating group activities. Sacrificing other cognitive abilities to preserve language capability would be an adaptive choice. The frontal regions, associated with planning and executive function, also show unexpected development, given the small overall size. This suggests that decision-making and behavioral control were also prioritized and protected during the miniaturization process. But what was lost? What cognitive abilities did Floresiensis sacrifice? We can't know for certain without living subjects to test, but educated guesses are possible. Abstract, symbolic thinking, the kind that produces art, music, and complex burial rituals, probably suffered. No Floresiensis art has ever been found, no decorative objects, no evidence of symbolic behavior beyond tool-making and hunting. Their cognitive world was probably much more concrete, more focused on immediate practical concerns, less capable of the kind of abstract reasoning that characterizes modern human thought. Long-term planning, the ability to think months or years into the future, may have been limited. Their tools don't show the kind of regional variation and stylistic evolution that suggests fashion trends or symbolic meanings. Mathematical and quantitative reasoning, the ability to count large numbers or perform complex calculations, was probably minimal. Even modern humans with full-sized brains struggled with these capabilities until recently. A brain one-third the size would find them nearly impossible. Yet, despite these limitations, Floresiensis succeeded. They survived. They adapted. They passed knowledge between generations. They occupied an ecological niche successfully for longer than most species persist. This demonstrates something profound about intelligence. There isn't one kind of intelligence. There isn't one optimal brain configuration. There are many solutions to the problem of survival, many ways to be cognitively capable, many combinations of abilities that work in different environments. Floresiensis found a solution that worked for them, a small, efficient brain that could do what needed doing on Flores Island without consuming more resources than the environment could provide. It wasn't the solution we took. Our brains got bigger, more energy-hungry, more dependent on rich food sources. But their solution was equally valid for their circumstances. And it worked until those circumstances changed and we arrived. The implications extend far beyond Homo floresiensis. If small brains can support complex cognition through reorganization, then intelligence isn't strictly limited by size. This matters for artificial intelligence research, where creating more efficient neural networks remains a critical challenge. Current AI systems require massive computational resources, thousands of processors, enormous power consumption. But biological brains accomplish comparable or superior performance with just 20 watts of power. Understanding how Floresiensis packed functionality into a tiny brain might reveal principles for building more efficient artificial systems. It also matters for understanding extinct species. We tend to dismiss animals with small brains as unintelligent. But crows with brains smaller than walnuts use tools. Octopuses with distributed neural networks solve complex problems. Bees with brains smaller than sesame seeds navigate, communicate, and build sophisticated structures. Intelligence takes many forms. Brain size predicts some capabilities. But organization, efficiency, and specialization matter more than we've acknowledged. The Floresiensis story also reveals how evolution can reverse direction when circumstances demand it. For most of human evolution, selection favored larger brains despite their enormous metabolic costs. The advantages, better problem solving, improved social coordination, enhanced learning, outweighed the disadvantages. But on Flores, that calculation reversed. Limited food resources made large brains too expensive. The metabolic burden outweighed the benefits, and selection drove brain size downward, sacrificing some cognitive abilities to maintain overall viability. This wasn't devolution or degeneration, it was adaptation. Floresiensis didn't become less fit, they became differently fit, optimized for their specific environment rather than for some abstract standard of intelligence. Evolution doesn't have goals, it doesn't progress toward better or more advanced forms. It simply produces whatever works for surviving and reproducing in current conditions. On Flores, small bodies and small brains worked. So that's what evolution produced. Understanding this challenges the way we think about human uniqueness. We like to believe that our large brains make us special, that intelligence is what separates us from other animals, that cognitive capability is the defining feature of humanity. But Floresiensis proves that you can be human with a brain the size of an ape. You can make tools, hunt cooperatively, maintain culture, and survive successfully without approaching modern human brain capacity. What makes us human isn't primarily brain size, it's behavioral flexibility, social learning, cumulative culture, and technological adaptation. These capabilities can be supported by brains of different sizes, organized in different ways, optimized for different environments. Floresiensis was as human as we are, just differently human, adapted to different circumstances, succeeding through different strategies. They prove that humanity is broader, more diverse, and stranger than our species-centric view acknowledges, and their extinction reminds us that even successful adaptations fail when conditions change too rapidly and competitors arrive with different advantages. 22 years after the discovery of Homo floresiensis, after thousands of hours of excavation, after analysis by hundreds of researchers, after publications in the world's most prestigious scientific journals, fundamental questions remain unanswered. The Hobbits revealed themselves to science in 2003, but they didn't reveal all their secrets. Critical gaps in our knowledge persist, and each gap represents not just missing information, but an entire chapter of human evolution that remains unwritten, hidden beneath the soil of Flores, or lost forever to the degradation of time. What we don't know about Homo floresiensis might be more important than what we do know, because those unknowns point toward the limits of our understanding and the vastness of what might still be discovered. The most fundamental question remains unresolved. Where did they come from? Despite decades of debate, despite detailed anatomical analyses, despite statistical comparisons with every known hominin species, we still cannot definitively place Floresiensis on our family tree. The two main hypotheses, descent from Homo erectus through island dwarfing, or descent from more primitive ancestors like Homo habilis or early African hominins, both face serious challenges. The erectus hypothesis struggles to explain the extreme brain reduction and some primitive skeletal features. The primitive ancestor hypothesis struggles to explain how such early hominins crossed to Indonesia when no fossil evidence supports their presence outside Africa. As of 2025, the scientific community has not reached consensus. Different researchers favor different origins based on which anatomical features they prioritize. And without DNA, which tropical conditions have destroyed, genetic evidence cannot resolve the debate. The mystery of Hobbit ancestry persists. Recent discoveries on Sulawesi, the large island north of Flores, have complicated the picture further. In 2025, researchers announced stone tools on Sulawesi dating to over 1 million years ago, similar in age to the oldest Flores tools, but different in some technical features. Who made these Sulawesi tools? Were they created by the same hominin population that reached Flores, or by a different group, another erectus variant, or unknown species that colonized different islands independently? The geographic distribution of early hominin sites across the Indonesian archipelago suggests complex migration patterns, possibly multiple waves of colonization, possibly multiple hominin species coexisting on different islands. We've found Floresiensis on Flores and Luzonensis on Luzon. How many other islands harbored their own unique hominin populations? How many species evolved in isolation on islands we haven't thoroughly explored? The archipelago contains thousands of islands. We've excavated only a handful. The potential for additional discoveries is enormous. The question of Floresiensis extinction timing also remains uncertain. The youngest definite fossils date to approximately 60,000 years ago, the youngest stone tools to 50,000 years ago. But the gap between archaeological evidence and local folklore is troubling. The Ebu Gogo legends claim the last small people died only centuries ago, killed by villagers in their caves. While genetic evidence disproves survival until recent times, the specificity of the stories suggests some basis in reality. Could a small Floresiensis population have survived in remote areas until 10,000 or even 5,000 years ago, long after the main population disappeared? The island has not been comprehensively surveyed. Remote highland caves and isolated valleys might harbor younger fossils that would dramatically revise our understanding of when and how Floresiensis vanished. Until every cave system has been explored, until every potential site has been excavated, the possibility of more recent survival cannot be entirely dismissed. We also don't know how Floresiensis interacted with modern humans when our species first reached Flores. Did they meet? Almost certainly, given that modern human arrival around 50,000 years ago coincides with Floresiensis disappearance. But what happened during those encounters? Was there violence? Competition? Avoidance? The fossil record preserves no evidence of direct interaction. No Floresiensis skeletons with weapon wounds. No modern human sites with hobbit remains suggesting capture or consumption. No hybrid fossils indicating interbreeding, though such hybrids would be difficult to identify from skeletal remains alone. The genetic evidence shows no Floresiensis DNA in modern populations, suggesting either that interbreeding never occurred or that hybrid lineages didn't survive. But the circumstances of extinction, the mechanisms by which modern humans displaced or destroyed the Floresiensis population, remain speculative. We know they disappeared when we arrived. We don't know exactly how or why. The cognitive capabilities of Floresiensis remain frustratingly uncertain. We know they made stone tools. We know they hunted cooperatively. These facts establish minimum cognitive abilities. But what was their upper limit? Did they have language? The enlarged temporal lobes suggest auditory processing capacity, but we can't determine whether they used simple proto-language, full grammatical language, or something in between. Did they have symbolic thought? No art or decorative objects have been found suggesting limited symbolic capabilities. But absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. Organic materials like wood, fiber, and feathers don't preserve. If Floresiensis created art from perishable materials, we would never know. Did they have music, storytelling, spiritual beliefs? With brain function dependent on soft tissue that decayed long ago, these questions may be permanently unanswerable. We can reconstruct bones. We cannot reconstruct minds. The broader question of how many hominin species existed during the Middle and Late Pleistocene remains open. We've discovered Floresiensis, Luzonensis, Neanderthals, Denisovans, and Homo sapiens all coexisting between 300,000 and 30,000 years ago. But the fossil record is sparse and geographically limited. Most hominin fossils come from specific regions: East Africa, South Africa, Europe, and parts of Asia. Vast areas of the planet, including most of Southeast Asia, Siberia, Central Asia, and Sub-Saharan Africa, have yielded few or no hominin fossils. This isn't because hominins weren't there, it's because conditions for fossilization are poor, because excavation has been limited, or because we haven't looked in the right places. Every few years brings a new discovery: Homo naledi in South Africa in 2013, Homo luzonensis in the Philippines in 2019, new Denisovan fossils in Tibet in 2019. Each discovery reveals a species we didn't know existed. How many more are waiting? 10 additional species? 20? 50? The number of hominin species that have existed is certainly larger than the number we've discovered, and the true diversity of human evolution might dwarf our current understanding. The possibility of survival in isolated populations haunts discussions of Floresiensis and other extinct hominins. Modern humans are uniquely widespread, occupying every continent except Antarctica, dominating every major ecosystem. But for most of hominin history, populations were small, isolated, vulnerable to local extinction. Small groups in remote areas could persist for thousands of years without leaving fossil evidence. Consider the Denisovans, known primarily from DNA and a few bone fragments, yet they contributed genes to modern populations from Siberia to Papua New Guinea. They must have been widespread and numerous, yet their fossil record is nearly invisible. Could similar populations, Homo floresiensis or unknown species, survive in remote areas today? The Indonesian islands contain vast tracts of unexplored rainforest. Siberia has remote valleys accessible only by air. Africa has mountain ranges where few outsiders venture. The odds of large, undiscovered hominin populations are low, but the odds of small, relict groups surviving in extreme isolation are not zero. Local legends from many regions describe wild men, forest people, creatures that resemble humans but aren't quite human. Most are probably folklore. But if even one is real, if even one small population of archaic humans has survived into the present, it would revolutionize everything we understand about human evolution, extinction, and what it means to be the last human standing. The story of Homo floresiensis is ultimately a story about how little we know and how much remains hidden. 22 years of research have revealed a species that shouldn't exist according to our theories, that challenges our assumptions about intelligence and brain size, that demonstrates evolutionary flexibility we didn't know was possible. They survived for at least 650,000 years on a remote island, miniaturized their bodies and brains to impossible dimensions, maintained tool-making traditions longer than our species has existed, and then vanished exactly when we arrived. Every answer raises new questions. Every discovery reveals how incomplete our understanding remains. And beneath the soil of Flores, beneath the caves we haven't explored, beneath the islands we haven't excavated, more answers wait. More fossils, more species, more chapters of human evolution that haven't been written yet. The Hobbits taught us that human diversity was greater than we imagined, that evolution could take paths we never predicted, that our family tree is bushier and stranger than any textbook shows. And they taught us humility, because despite all our technology, all our analytical methods, all our scientific sophistication, we still cannot answer basic questions about where they came from, how they lived, or exactly what happened when they met us. The mystery persists. And perhaps that's fitting, because the unknown keeps us searching, keeps us questioning, keeps us aware of how much we've yet to discover about ourselves, our origins, and the many other ways of being human that once existed on this planet.